3 words are handed to me like a gift that I can choose to open or not. Jesus loves you. These words find voice in the kitchen in my home in East London, England, the country of my birth. I listen. Jesus loves you. These words stunned me, wooed me, accepted me. I wept hard tears. For a while I could not stop crying. I did not know why, but they touched me very deeply, and I'm sorry. I know this is a testimony that is not very academic, but it is what it is. I understand that the words Jesus loves you may not work for everyone. After all, not everyone embraced Jesus or his words in his lifetime, so why should we today? I understand that representations of God are complex, diverse, paradoxical, and even laughable. And as I say this, I think of Monty Python's The Life of Brian. Yes, it documents the life of a man called Brian who was mistaken for a Messiah figure by many. This man is not perfect. Indeed, his mother declares that he is a very naughty boy. Anyway, I digress. Brian is overwhelmed by the adoration of those who follow him for seemingly no reason. When the masses chase him, he tries to dodge them at every opportunity. When he drops his shoe, his followers lift it up in the air and claim it as some sort of holy symbol. And when they gather in a courtyard, Brian, who is now cornered and in despair and in desperate need to quell the adoration that surrounds him, announces from a balcony overlooking the courtyard, "Please, please, please listen. I've got 1 or 2 things to say." And the crowd say, tell us both of them. And Brian says, "Look, you've got it all wrong. You don't need to follow me. You don't need to follow anybody. You've got to think for yourselves. You're all individuals." And the crowd says, "Yes, we're all individuals." And Brian says, "You're all different." And the crowd says, "Yes, we are all different." And one man in the crowd says, "I'm not." And the crowd says, "Shh." The crowd all say, "Shh," when one person appears to deviate from their chorus by saying that he is not different. This scene tells us so much about how some of us encounter not only Christian communities of faith, but other group assemblies. To whom or what do we say, shh? Whatever group with which we align, what perspectives do we shh away through our apathy, our indifference, our cultural preferences, dare I even say it, our biases, and political affiliations? It's true, I earned a degree from the University of California, Berkeley in Ethnic Studies, which qualifies me to be a genius. And my areas of specialization is in African American literature and popular culture. And I am currently an associate professor in reconciliation studies at Bethel University, but I'm going to be really honest with you. As much as I enjoy my work, my identity is not rooted in what I do. In my own relationship with God, I can be fully myself. I'm not called to be a mindless functionary. I'm not called to leave my brain, my brain at the door when I encounter God. I can, like Job, a character in the Bible, argue with God and God can handle it. I can share my doubts and skepticism with God. I don't have to have it all together. I also don't have to think of others and not be consumed by myself. Sorry, I want to repeat that. I also have to think of others and not be consumed by myself. My relationship with God is as simple as it is complicated. My interactions with God are frustrating, perplexing, and fulfilling. It's messy. My faith is as personal as it is shaped by the diverse communities and environments with whom I interact. The concept of the strong black woman who endures all things, who is present to the needs of all people, who is what Zora Neale Hurston's character Nanny says in Their Eyes Are Watching God, the nigger woman of the world, presents many black women with ways of being that can call many of us to cultivate a mindset and practice of fortitude. We are often called to show resiliency in the midst of trials that, while commendable and important, and even at times essential, can discourage or shut down the ability of many of us to engage with the breadth and complexity of the emotions and weaknesses, strengths, and experiences that come with being human. To find times to rest, to practice self-care, communal care, or what I call God care, to know what is our work and what is not our work, to learn when to say no and yes, and to be in touch with our feelings of vulnerability, our states of being, that if we do not observe and nurture can cause us to deny our ability to embrace our fears, our sadness, our anger, and yes, even our joy. Confronting racial battles can be hard on the body, mind, and spirit. Confronting discrimination of any kind can erode one's sense of well-being. So when I think of the connection between race and reconciliation and justice and forgiveness, I'm reminded that we must not allow others to diminish our humanity. In my scholarship and writing, I try to find examples of those who cultivate a mindset and practice of agency by engaging with their vulnerabilities, embracing their needs, even as they confront injustice. One of my heroes in this regard is Sandra Bland, the young African-American woman who was stopped by a policeman in a seemingly routine traffic stop. She demanded that she be treated with respect and that she articulate her rights on her own terms. Sandra Bland was arrested and died in a police cell. The police officer who arrested her was charged for perjury later, but Sandra Bland is dead. And yet, Sandra speaks. She talked about in her visual blog, Sandra Speaks, about her joys and struggles. She embraced her complex human experiences, and she could still ask hard questions of herself and those who condone racial injustice and racial disparities in America. In one of her blog posts, Sandra Bland took on critics who disparaged the Black Lives Matter movement by daring such critics to show her a time in American history when all lives have mattered. I need to say that again to honor her presence, even though she is not with us physically. Show her a time in American history when all lives have mattered. Discrimination is real, but I refuse to give others the power to define me. I often say to my students that I don't do double consciousness. The great African-American thinker, activist, and academic W.B. Du Bois coined the term double consciousness in his 1903 classic, The Souls of Black Folk, when he maintains that it is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness. This sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Whenever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. For me personally, it makes no sense for me to place my work in the hands of those who cannot embrace all of me, especially since I can bring all of myself to God and know that I'm loved and cherished and accepted by God. Christians are not called to deny the ills of the world, nor are they called to deny their contribution to the pain of the world. We, Christians and non-Christians alike, so often use words as weapons to maim, undermine, and even destroy those with whom we disagree. The history of Christianity is full of examples of those who have used the name of Jesus to exploit, steal from, and abuse many people. To deny this truth would be to deny the existence of other people's sacred stories and histories. I personally have experienced great injustices in my life, but many people whom I've encountered have baptized me in kindness and shown me love through their words and actions. But love, reconciliation does not deny the pain of the world, and neither should we. Love, reconciliation is not passive, but calls us to listen and learn from, and to align with the disenfranchised, or as Jesus says, the least of these. Love, reconciliation calls us to consider how we relate to others. Love and reconciliation requires humility, and for us to confront our biases. And love and reconciliation requires us to be mindful that we use our privileges for the betterment of all. We do not live in a vacuum. As Martin Luther King says in his letter from a Berkeley jail, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And as the acclaimed African-American author Toni Morrison acknowledges in Paradise, love is not easy. As she says, love is divine only and difficult always. If you think it is easy, you are a fool. If you think it is natural, you are blind. It is a learned application without reason or motive except that it is God. You have to practice God. You have to think God carefully. And I'll end with this. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. testifies that he has decided to stick with love, for hate is too great a burden to bear. To this I say, amen, amen.
So thanks to the Veritas Forum and thanks to all the organizers for inviting me here today to what I expect to be a very engaging and fruitful discussion. It's really especially humbling to think about these issues and have this conversation during the week that we honor and celebrate the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who I believe is a really powerful model for how we can productively exchange ideas about reconciliation, faith, and the fight for racial equality and social justice. So we were asked today to think about how our academic pursuits, how our academic and research interests meld with our faith. So I was trained as a sociologist. I got my PhD in sociology from the University of California at Berkeley with a concentration on gender and feminist issues, which I approach from an intersectional lens, meaning I think about gender in relationship to race, sexuality, class, and other forms of social difference. So when I decided to go to graduate school and decided to embark on my career as an academic, I was motivated by three key factors. One, I wanted to be able to think critically about the world around me. Secondly, I wanted to make sense of myself. I wanted to give social relevance to the personal and intellectual curiosities that were tied to my identity and those around me. And third, I wanted to change the world. I wanted to engage in social justice. So as a sociologist, my work is to think deeply and question many of the taken for granted assumptions about how the world works. For example, right now I'm working on a book that looks at beauty pageants in Nigeria. And on the face, beauty pageants seem to be a pretty irrelevant site for asking any type of profound question. But in my work, I think about and talk about and write about how beauty pageants and larger debates about aesthetics and about beauty draw in broader issues of globalization, gender, and national identity. Through my work, I remain interested in understanding difference and inequality and the boundaries of community that we create, blur, and sometimes transcend. For example, through gender, race, immigration, and nationalism. My academic work formalized many of the questions I had growing up about difference, inequality, and power. It allowed me to think about both the similarities and inconsistencies between my own experiences and the larger social world. The questions I ask, how I ask them, how I go about answering them, are very much informed by who I am and my identity as a Black woman of Nigerian immigrant parents. I'm also motivated by engaging in social justice. And I think about my teaching about such emotionally and politically charged topics like racism and the social construction of gender as my own modest contribution to that endeavor. By asking students to think about social structures that prop up inequality, they can realize that they too can take part in dismantling those same structures that we all socially construct. I hope that through conversations in my classroom that we can have a deeper engagement, and that through the course material, students learn and understand the world around them in ways that directly translate into social action and trouble the status quo. So when I was asked and invited today to think about reconciliation, to think about social justice, and to think about faith, I'll be honest, I paused. I very rarely talk about my faith and my religion in public, and I think my religion is a very kind of private thing. And I think especially given kind of the social context in which we live in which there's a lot of Islamophobia, I was honestly felt vulnerable putting myself out there. And I've always kind of thought about my faith and academic pursuits as largely separate. And I think in my training as an academic, that was very much encouraged. There's a sort of assumption that in our research, we're supposed to, in some ways, kind of distance ourselves from that pursuit. But I've always approached my research and approached my intellectual interest through my own personal questions and my own identity. So I was raised Muslim by Nigerian immigrant parents who came to the US in the 1980s. Being born and largely raised in the US, my sense of what it means to be Muslim is very much shaped by growing up in America and growing up in the diverse Bay Area community where I was raised. My mother raised me along with my 4 siblings, largely as a single mother, and although she herself came from a fairly strict Muslim family, I wouldn't say that I was raised very religiously. We were enrolled in Sunday classes to learn how to read the Quran in Arabic, but we never completed the course. I was never urged to pray the 5 daily prayers, except during the New Year, when my mom insisted that we all pray together as a family. So my religious upbringing was inconsistent at best. And although I've always identified as Muslim, it wasn't until I got to college where I started to become more interested in learning about my own faith, spurred by the many typical questions that college students ask themselves of, who am I? Where do I belong? I'm sure questions that, if you're a college student, you're grappling with today. So as I continued to learn and think about my faith, I realized that many of the pathways that animate my research interests and animate my academic life, such as critical thought, thinking about identity, and social justice, remain relevant to my faith. In college, I discovered the concept of ijtihad, which is part of the Islamic doctrine that emphasizes personal struggle, independent reasoning, and deep thought. As a feminist who thinks intersectionally about global links between race, sexuality, gender, and class, my religious identity and faith serve as another important layer of my identity that informs the types of questions I ask and the gaps I see as I analyze the social world. I understand that my faith, I also come to my faith partly through the prism of social justice, compassion, and peace. In calling attention to the many injustices in our world, from police brutality targeting black men and women, the marginalization of students of color on college campuses, anti-Muslim rhetoric, xenophobic threats against undocumented immigrants, and the many other important issues tied to marginalized communities, I see a larger communal struggle that is tied to my research, tied to my teaching, and also tied to my faith. Thank you.
So, thank you, Dr. Kemi and Dr. Claudia. So we shall transition in asking our presenters a few questions, which are going to speak more to the subject here. So, and I'm going to start with you, Dr. Claudia. Can you tell me how your research and your personal experiences have informed what you believe about the human nature? Whether people are, fundamentally good or evil or both? And how does this align or conflict with your worldview?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? I feel like a Verizon man. Okay, so one of the hard things about this question, which is very dense theologically, I'm not a theologian and I'm not going to pretend to be, And I also, maybe this is the literature part of me, have an issue with seeing human nature as one conceptual theory. We are very diverse. We have many aspects to our human natures. So I also resist binarism, the sort of good and evil as sort of abstract terms, because I think what it does is it undermines the complexity of our humanity. Now, does that not mean that I think that many of us are capable of producing relationships that have conveyed much goodness to the world? And do I believe that we have the potential to be destructive in our actions and the way we use words? Yes, I do think we are capable, and that the possibilities in that regard are endless. For me personally, one of the reasons why it's hard for me to, even as I'm trying to understand who I am on an ongoing basis, is that on a typical day I could have a particular point of view about myself or an issue. And by having an interaction with somebody else that can be refined, challenged, problematized by that interaction. So for me, a central ethos of what it means for me to be fully human in the world that I live in is to be teachable. I have a dear elder whose daily prayer is, I pray that I will never be unteachable. And I really base that a lot on Jesus' ability to acknowledge some of the most marginalized and despised peoples that he interacted with, and uphold them as examples of faith, to reference these individuals in ways that would be honoring, and he often did this publicly, and challenge the religious leaders of the day, even his own disciples, his own followers. And I'm also reminded that there's a lot of ways in which I'm astounded how many people bombarded Jesus with questions and challenged him. So, not that I invite you all to do that with me tonight, I have to say, but one of the things that as a leader, I find him really quite remarkable in the sense that he doesn't stop people from questioning him, and he never silences people when they talk to him. So for me, as I'm learning what it means to be human, I take a lot of inspiration from those biblical narratives. I mess up a lot. I certainly can't say that I'm perfect, although I do say to my students regularly that I'm the genius of the family. I think there are various factors that influence who we are and our behaviors, and part of, I think, the thrill and the challenges of embracing all of my humanity, even though I think that I have to wonder, is that fully possible in my lifetime? Because I feel that when I discover things about who I am, other layers come up. But the journey is one that can be both joyous and painful, some of those discoveries. It means that for me, it's hard for me just to see any group of people in a completely romantic light. Because I do think we're very complicated, and the potential for us, like I said, to be hurtful, to be affirming, to recognize each other's value is not easy. I do think it's important in that process to not deny what we can learn from others. And I'm really, it was a student from the Dominican Republic in my class last semester that I say was the real conscious of our class. And she comes from a culture that doesn't think so much in the I, but in the we. And sometimes you don't realize how much you're part of a particularly dominant discourse until you interact with somebody else. And for me, the we, even though my parents are of Jamaican descent, this we, I started thinking a lot about the I, we, and how they're very much interconnected. And the we is not essentialist. It has various components, various diversities in that. as is the I. But living in that tension has become a really important part of my formation. I find that the narratives of my life, plural, is not linear. It can be both, it can be circular, and even with that circularity, there was like revelations that come that I wasn't aware of. But I do feel that in terms of reconciliation, and I take this from Bonhoeffer's view, that it doesn't practice cheap grace or a cheap form of peace. I think that there's going to be a call to deal with many challenges and many sacrifices when you think of those who confront injustice on a daily basis. And that's not something that I would say is everyone should do, but I do feel personally, as a Christian, that I feel called to ask other Christians those kinds of hard questions. I don't feel a calling or qualified to tell others outside of that, this is how you should live and this is what you should do. It's a little bit like, have any of you been in a situation where somebody has said something about a family member, and part of your impulse is to say, no, that's not your job. But you will critique your own family. I don't know if anybody's had that experience. And I feel that my call is to challenge those of us who say that we're Christians. How are you loving others? How are you dealing with injustice? How are you following the way of Jesus? And we have to really hold each other accountable in that regard. So I have no problem doing that.
Thank you, Claudia. I will pose the same question to Kemi. And I can repeat it for the sake of our audience here. How has your research and your personal experiences informed what you believe about human nature? Are people good, evil, or are they both? How does this align or conflict with your worldview?
Yeah, so I want to pick up a lot on what Dr. May said in terms of thinking about the question. It's a pretty, from my perspective, a flawed question, because again, I resist this idea of a binary, that people are either fundamentally in their human nature good or fundamentally in their human nature evil. So the way that I tend to think about it is that people are kind of limited. There's kind of possibilities and then there's limitations. So kind of a combination of the larger social forces that are relevant in our society, but then interacting with people's personal choices and people's personal agency, that kind of informs the way that people live their lives. So again, I'm wary of thinking about people as kind of innately or in their human nature being good or evil. And that's definitely the sociologist in me. So I think that it's more thinking about, what are the instances, the conditions, the circumstances where you find that people have the possibility to change the world or have the possibility to think about these questions from a more holistic perspective versus, what are the ways that people feel constrained or limited and to not even think about these questions or feeling constrained by their circumstances. So I think that I feel like the question is sort of flawed in a way because I don't really think about it, as you said, in that kind of binary way, good versus evil. Because I think there's streaks of both, actually, in our human society, if you look. There's streaks.
Because apart from me, because I'm perfect, the reality is, and I'm going to throw this out there, you may have got this a bit, I kind of engage with this, not to undermine the seriousness of what we're talking about, but I do think we have to give enough room for one another to also we talked about this over dinner actually, give each other the space to grow, to discover, to make mistakes. And I think for those of us who are academics and we're so immersed in this stuff, it's hard. I think my students are a gift in this regard because they remind me, oh, this is where I've been. Not to say that I've arrived. I am joking about being perfect. No, I'm not. Anyway, I am joking about that, seriously. But I do think humility for me is really key. And this whole notion of teachability. Just in the short time that I had a conversation with Kemi, I've learned much from her. And those seeds, I think, will continue as I engage with others. So I think that's important. The relational piece, the ability to move in different circles, I think, is really key. Different regions and engage with different belief systems. And I do think, from a sociologist's perspective, we know that there are some people who live in so-called ghettos because of infrastructures that have been set up to keep them there. Okay? But I also think there are other kinds of ghettos that people create for themselves, where they are engaging with people who look like them or who share certain values and aren't really willing to engage with others outside of that. Either way, what it does is I think it definitely encourages us to not only the binarism, but to stick with certain categorizations.
Right. So I want to bring us to today and probably the last few months. We have had a lot going on, and both of you have talked about the injustices of the past and the current. But I want you to respond, each one of you, about injustices like what we have seen in Charleston or what we saw in Oregon the other day at Anchor Community College and other places. So what role does anger play, and when is it appropriate? What is the role of forgiveness when it is forgiveness appropriate? And how do the two coexist in the lives of the oppressed or the vulnerable? So do you want to start, Kemi?
Sure. So I wanted to talk, I guess, more about anger, because I think that when we think about anger, we think about it as being a very frustrating emotion, an emotion that doesn't feel very useful at times. But I think that anger can be productive. So Audre Lorde, who is a feminist, a Black feminist, talks about the uses of power, uses of anger and the power in that. And that when you're able to recognize your anger, you're able to use that productively to name social injustice and to be able to name what can I do to counteract that. So I think that instead of thinking about anger as being purely limiting or thinking about it as kind of an uncontrollable emotion, there's a lot of power and usefulness behind that. And then also thinking about, so we're asked to think about, anger and forgiveness. Instead of that kind of tension, what I was thinking about is that it's more of kind of a tension between fear and fearlessness, especially in thinking about kind of vulnerable and the oppressed. Because I think there's a certain level of fear involved when you're trying to counteract social injustice, putting yourself out there, using your voice in that way, calling for action, but at the same time, there's still that fearlessness in that, and saying that in using my voice, in naming injustice, there's a certain kind of fearlessness around that, and being able to speak out when you see injustice. So that was kind of the way that I was seeing that question, especially in line of thinking about vulnerability, thinking about oppression, and thinking about social justice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think anger can be productive. It can also be destructive, self-destructive, if you internalize it. I think anger needs to be released, but you need to create also safe spaces for that to be released. I think if you tie anger with a particular expectation of how an individual group of people respond to that, what you do is you give a power to those who you want to convince that your anger is legitimate. I think you need to be mindful of that, because I saw this recently at a march where somebody was very angry about racial injustice and wanted certain members of an establishment to embrace their anger, and that was not happening. One of the things I did wasn't so much to fix that anger or even to simmer it down, but to recognize and acknowledge the anger. And I went over to that person and I was able to, just felt sense to just affirm, I hear you. I hear you, I see you. And that person, I think, it was so interesting to see that person not, again, I say, diminish or deny his anger, but there was something about that acknowledgement that was really not only affirming, but helped to calm him in the midst of that. I think that's important. And I think for me, as a Christian, I think anger is also another emotion that God created. So for me, it's very important for me to give my anger to God. And what saddens me in a number of Christian communities is that a lot of Christian communities don't know what to do with anger. And so they try to suppress it. Yeah, for real. And to kind of create a persona of Christianity that denies that emotion in certain circles. And so for me, it's really important that I'm very real with God. And I mentioned in my opening introduction that to be able, Job argued with God. You know, there came a point when he had to wrestle, and I think for me that's really important and very liberating, I have to say. But feeling that emotion, lamenting, there's a number of scholars and other leaders that are talking about this notion of prophetic lamentation. Because I think they come together. How do you grieve well in justice? And also, forgiveness is not a one-time deal in regards to, just as anger doesn't have one particular kind of form of expression, for me, forgiveness is key. And if you're a member of the marginalized dealing with injustice, forgiveness is something that you have to constantly deal with. I mean, in Charleston, the beloved Charleston 9, there was a lot of criticism about those who forgave the young man who killed this beloved 9 in Charleston. And I remember one of the great, and if you don't know her, you will know more about her, Reverend Tracy Blackman, who was really one of the guiding lights in this here civil rights movement. She made a comment that, at the end of the day, it's not for us to regulate when and how people forgive. This may be a part of some members' grieving process.
Yeah, and I think just to piggyback off of that really quickly, to think about, so the point that you raised about the Charleston 9 and thinking about how faith could be a way of kind of channeling then that anger, and gets to the point that you were talking about how anger, not just internalizing it, but making meaning out of it, and how forgiveness can also be a part of that.
And it's not easy at all, I want to say that. And it's not for us to police people's behaviors in how they forgive and what they forgive. But from a very selfish point of view, what I'm learning, I've not arrived in this, forgiveness is good for my own well-being. Because when I live in a state of unforgiveness, it is actually self-destructive. It really shuts me off from so much that I can experience from others. But I've not arrived there. There are areas in my life that I find it easier to forgive than in others.
So I want to transition us very quickly before we invite our audience to ask any questions. I want to ask you maybe 30 seconds. You're both telling us how to deal with this from the inside and how to manage anger and how to manage forgiveness. But I'm wondering, what resources, can you tell us maybe one or two resources as a Christian? You are telling us to give our anger to God, but can you tell the audience what resources do you see in your faith that support you, especially when there's so much, economic differences and so much inequality, especially among our African American communities?
Yeah, and I actually think that when I give my anger to God, that's not and I pray. That is not to say I'm going to stay there. The next question for me is, what do I do in response to? Love and action, love is a verb. You can't be in some, I feel like how we contribute or how we respond to injustice, I want to be guided by God in how I do that personally. So prayer is key. I think it's going to be really important in prayer for Christians to be really honest about their their resistance to certain issues. So if Black Lives Movement means nothing to you, if you have a resistance towards that, one of the things, I'm talking to Christians now, I'm not talking to anybody else. I mean, I love y'all, but I told you I don't. Is really to ask God to give that to God in the sense of, I have a bias, I don't like this,
Okay.
and then be open to asking the question, how do you respond? There are practical things, other practical things that you can do. In Flint, Michigan, you have communities, predominantly African Americans, poor people who are not given the dignity to drink water, clean water in their communities. Now, you have a church there that's providing water for Michigan residents, and a Muslim group called Who is Hussein distributed 30,000 bottles of water to Flint, Michigan. I mean, that kind of practical response.
So not only, an approach from the heart in our faith, but also being practical about it. Give us one way that we should cope with this.
Well, as a Muslim, I think, as I mentioned briefly in my remarks, I definitely approach my faith through the lens of social justice and through the lens of social responsibility. So if you read the Quran, it says that one of the ways in which you show your closeness to God is by showing social justice, by being just. So I think that in terms of Islam, that's kind of one resource I see in thinking about how your faith, how your religious belief, or your broader spiritual sense is linked to a broader idea of social responsibility and civic engagement. So how is it that your way of looking at the world, your worldview, is shaped by how you can give back in some way?
Exactly. And I think my dear elder said, when I thanked her for pouring so much into me as a professor at Berkeley, and I said, what should I do to thank you? And she said, pass it on. I do think, I'm going to be bold here, every single person in this room has privileges. What do you do with those privileges? I mean, I think there comes a point where we have to be aware of what are the resources that we have, and to whom do we just share those resources with. If it's only with people who look like us, or then there's a problem there. And I think we need to really be challenged to think about how we use our privileges for the greater good.
So, in the interest of time, I will pause there with our presenters, but I want to invite the audience. We have a microphone here. If you have a question to our presenters, either Kemi or Claudia, would you please come over and ask that question, and I'll ask either of them to respond. Thank you. We have about 20 minutes, so...
What does forgiveness actively look like for you? And then what does it also actively look like to say that something's unforgivable? Like if you're not willing to forgive it.
So what can you forgive and what can you not forgive? What's forgivable, what's unforgivable? Kemi?
Wow, so that's, I think, so context dependent in the sense that, personally, I feel like thinking generally about what's forgivable and what's unforgivable, that's very much shaped by the context in which it happened, right? So I think that there's a certain kind of power in forgiveness and being able to get to that place in which you're saying, you're kind of letting go in some ways. But I don't think that's an expectation that we should have of everyone, to be able to get to that stage, because it involves a lot of, I want to say in some ways, sacrifice, of being able to say, I can forgive you for doing this.
So do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think forgiveness, I agree with Kemi, it's not just about context. I keep on coming back to, it's not easy. I've known in my own life there are layers to this forgiveness. So one is that I've allowed myself to not rush into forgiveness, but to live in the tension of the pain that I'm feeling. I think it's really important, at least for me, to do that. The other is, just think of an example where I was assaulted by a white male when I was an undergraduate in a pub in England. And one of the things that was hard for me during that time was that I was the only black person surrounded by all my white friends. And to top it off, the police that came said they could do nothing about it. And I mean, we were all stunned by how this happened, but when I wanted to tell, I come from the east of London, and back in the day, you mess with somebody, then there were repercussions. So I had a dear friend there. I may be a Christian, but I love thuggery movies, and there's a reason for that. And one of the things that, anybody wants to talk about The Godfather, please talk to me. I know it verbatim. Anyway, so when my friend found out that I'd been assaulted, he wanted to know who it was. And he said, my brother is a 6'6", dreads right down to the back, gorgeous black man and strong. And he called my brother and he said, right, you know, this has happened to Claudia. Get a group together and we'll sort this out. And you know, I won't lie. There was a part of me that said, yeah. But I also knew context that for a dozen black men to travel from London to York, which is very white, and the opportunity for them to get arrested and jailed would be great. And so I chose not to have them come up. What ended up happening was I saw that white man on the stairwell and he smirked. And I just thought, well, you know, you're lucky, you know, for real. But I didn't say anything. It took me years to heal from that experience, years. And it took me years to see the perspectives that my friends were afraid. They didn't know what to do. They were stunned. As the forgiveness deepened, I was able to appreciate the nuances of the story. But what I can say is this: forgiveness does not mean forgetting. Even in the Bible, there is no such thing as forgive and forget. That's a law. And I think these stories and the memories of them are very insightful in learning for me, how to relate to God, how to relate to others. I can honestly say I have too many wonderful brothers who are white men who have really battled for me in major ways. And if I didn't forgive, it would have shut me off from these incredible men in my life. But that's not to say that they're free of the biases that come with being a white male in society, but they are very real about that, you know?
So as we contemplate about forgiveness, if you have a question, would you please come to the microphone? I'm sure somebody else has a question. Sir?
Give me a moment.
Okay. So if you have a question, come up, but I want to kind of reiterate just what you're saying, that forgiving is unburdening yourself. It is allowing you to be free. But I'm also hearing that it's also a process. Sometimes you can just drop it. So go ahead.
That is painful.
That is painful.
Yeah.
Hi, this is mainly for Kemi. Islam has been poisoned pretty much by radical Islamic terrorists. And so the question for you is, how do you purge your religion from the hatred? And for the Christians, it would be, how do you purge Christianity from the hatred of Westboro Baptist Church?
Right.
And I think one of the major things we need to do is name that Islamic terrorism. And ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Boko Haram, almost all Islamic terrorists are Wahhabist. And the House of Saud for 200 years has been allied with Wahhabism. The difference between Wahhabism and other Muslims is that they have declared takfir, or apostate, all non-Wahhabists. And so they think that it's all right to murder non-believers, and anyone but Wahhabists. So the question is, how can you get some Wahhabi imam to declare a fatwa against killing innocent civilians? And how can you get them to declare that they go to hell instead of heaven? And how can you define heaven as a place where you pet puppies rather than rape women?
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't know precisely the process of how that will happen, but I can talk a little bit about my thoughts about what I think I as a Muslim could do. Because I think that, one, there's kind of been this discussion about what do we even name radical, like how do we name radical Islam? Should we call it radical Islam? People have said, should we call it a cult? You know, that it's not really divorce it from Islam because it's not, that people say that it's not Islam. And I think you're pointing to that, the way that we understand kind of radical Islam is tied to a particular time and moment. There's a history behind why radical Islam and why terrorism globally is happening in this particular moment. It's not in isolation, it's not just because of religious conviction, it's tied to particular politics, geography, etc., right? So I think that a lot of people kind of quibble about whether should we call it radical Islam, should we not call it radical Islam. I think that the same ways in which you have, if you have a fringe group in any community doing something that the overwhelming majority of people of that faith say, this doesn't represent me, this doesn't represent my religion, that same way in which people take that on its face and say, listen, one fringe group doesn't speak for this whole 1.5 billion people around the world, I think that same kind of understanding should be extended to Muslims around the world. So I think that if you have this small community, it doesn't speak for all of the religion. And I think that a lot of people will say that, oh, Muslims aren't speaking enough to say that terrorism is wrong, to talk about that this is extremism, but my response is that you're not listening. Because people have been, every single time there's a terrorist attack, people are saying, this is not my religion. They do not stand for my religion. And then secondly, the most, so all the different terrorist groups you've named, the number one targets are other Muslims, right? So more Muslims have died at the hands of Islamic fundamentalists than, you know, other people around the world. So I think that also recognizing that there's a contestation happening, but it's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening during a particular historical moment that there's meanings attached to it.
I think this is a very, very good point. You say it so eloquently. There's a couple of triggers for me also, is who we identify as terrorists and not, and who we identify as militia and not. And I think this is very raced in terms of who we see as a threat. And so I think that a kind of a critical engagement of who is isolated as being, if you like, the essentialist representatives of these terms, we need to problematize. I mean, it's because it's, not only is it essentialist, but it becomes very inclusive of a whole group of people. So I personally am very much against the Islamophobia that is so, in many ways, has become so normative, especially in mainstream media. And with that, I would say, because, you know, Ashley, as a Christian, I know that partly there are many Christians, in terms of our apathy, at times our unwillingness to deal with the hard questions, to see to really live out seeing our neighbor as ourselves, to live out what I think are really fundamental aspects of the Christian faith. It doesn't surprise me that it's a turnoff for a lot of people, for real, because we're not willing to engage. A number of us are not willing to engage those issues and to stand alongside those who are marginalized, who are despised, by those who have the power to dictate who gets categorized and in what way. Which is why I think it's really important that we do step out of our, because there's a lot of people out of our comfort zones. Because there's a lot of people who say they're Christian and they justify what they're doing, but it has absolutely nothing to do with how Jesus lived, or what he said and how he did it. And that's problematic. And there's a woman, a Palestinian-American Muslim. Her name is Linda Sazor. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. But one of the things I said earlier is I feel Jesus often took the most enlightened of people to teach his followers and the disciples about the love, wisdom, and power of God. And for me, one of her comments was, if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. And that's given me some pause to think, because there have been certain times in my life where I've had to not engage with certain outlets because I didn't realize this was happening until I sort of caught myself, or I think God really arrested my spirit that I was, by reading certain outlets, I was beginning to reduce people to a stock figure, which is quite frightening to admit that, but I think it's important. I think if I'm really going to live out this faith, I can be that real with God and say, you know what, this is happening. And I sense through prayer that I need to not engage with that particular outlet because it was having a particular slant. And I'm telling you, the fruit of that has been my ability to engage with people who I was beginning to be suspicious of or put at a distance from myself. This is not attractive stuff to admit, but I think it's important to be honest about the ways in which we can embrace certain perspectives that are not honoring of others. There's always going to be extremes, I think, in any circle. And I don't think you're going to always, I actually don't believe you can eradicate those extremes.
I mean, it's interesting, for some of us who come from, countries where you have grown up with Muslims and you go to school with them, they're part of your community, and now, the rhetoric is the other way around. It's very hard to balance that sometimes. But because we have just about 10 minutes left, make it brief, maybe that's our last question before I wrap up.
Dr. May, you talked about not having cheap forms of grace or cheap forms of peace. And maybe it's because of my Asian background, but I sometimes find it really difficult to talk about race because it kind of rocks the boat. Yeah. And I'm kind of wondering, what does grace look like in a context
What does
grace look like in the context of race? And what does real peace look like when you're having these difficult discussions?
Yeah. What does grace look like? I think for me, grace looks like being able to appreciate that in many ways we are all a work in progress, and that progress is not, like I said, linear, but I'm learning and this is what I know from Jesus, is because I think the disciples didn't get it most of the time. I think they were a motley crew. I think they were a real mess. They were a hot mess. And, they could see Jesus heal like 4,000 in the morning, cast out demons from somebody in midday, and then 5,000 people come to get food. And they say, so what do we do now? And I always imagine Jesus going, let's go for this one more time, shall we? I'm astounded that his patience and ability, like when the disciples argue about who is the greatest, and they do so even though, Jesus is right there, but they're talking about themselves, who is the greatest. And when Jesus, but he doesn't interrupt them when they're having this discussion and this debate. And when they actually end up, when he actually asks them, their response is silence. And rather than berate them it becomes a teachable moment. And I find his response actually quite tender in that regard. So grace for me is literally giving people the space to at times ponder, to let go of trying to fix people when they don't conform to your viewpoint, when you want them to conform to your viewpoint. Grace for me is recognizing that you are also a work in progress and how God deals with your own hot mess. I don't sense in my own relationship God's sense of condemnation. In terms of, I think honestly, Scripture, especially when I look at Jesus' ministry, because to me that's very tied to reconciliation. I've yet to find a time when Jesus went to somebody's home to eat and something didn't kick off. And so I think the notion of peace, I mean, I like the idea of peace with, that surpasses all understanding. So I can find myself more and more being in a situation of conflict, but have peace in it if I don't feel like I have to fix people or to have them arrive at a kind of peace that's contrived. You know, I kind of call it the holier than thou peace. The kind of peace that's like, so, you know, and I was like, that means nothing to me, okay? So peace looks very different for many different people. I've learned not to equate peace with silence, because I think you can have internal wars within yourself and create a composure of peace that doesn't reflect that.
So we've learned a lot from your perspective, Kemi, from Claudia, from the audience. There's a lot to ponder about: justice, forgiveness, peace, space, unburdening ourselves, loving from the heart, but also in practical ways. But I want us to, maybe in one sentence, 2 sentences as we end, I would want to know from you. You know, we are talking about racial injustice, about, you know, other forms of imbalances in our society. So is there hope? Is there hope between Muslims and Christians, or majority and minorities? Is there hope? Kemi?
I think there definitely is hope. And one way that I like to think about it is this idea of respect. So a lot of the time when you think about, when people talk about race, or they talk about inequality, people use the term tolerance, which I personally really despise. Because when you use the word tolerance, it kind of implies that, oh, I'm going to tolerate you. I'll tolerate you. I don't need to learn about you. I don't need to figure out where you're from, but I'll tolerate you because you're different from me. But I've always kind of centralized this idea of respect, because that a true form of respect is that not only do you see and recognize difference, you appreciate it, and in that appreciation, you grow to even embrace it further, right? And in terms of hope, I definitely think that there are spaces for hope. If you look around what's happening in our world today, there's so many different social movements. Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name. You see all of these ways in which people are speaking up and saying, this is not right, you know, this is wrong. So I think that there are those spaces for hope and thinking about social change. Even though it's difficult, even though it won't be easy, even though it will be messy, I still see hope.
Do you see hope, Claudia?
I definitely see hope, because I could look around this room and not see them as my enemy, which you're lucky. I see hope when I leave an airport and I see an African-American family waiting for other family members, and there is such love there. I see hope in family reunions that happen all over this country that are led by members of the African-American community. I see hope in my own church, where we have a sensitivity to recent immigrants and partnering them in their journey and not seeing them as their enemy. I see hope when people are able to put together supplies for kids who don't have the money to, parents don't have the money to purchase those gifts, those school supplies, and they're not thinking, I've paid my taxes and therefore why should I be investing money into these kids. I see hope in the ability to be able to love in the midst of adversity. I certainly see hope in many of the prophetic words of Martin Luther King Jr., who himself was as flawed as me, but was used, I think, really mightily amongst many, many people, because this was not a one-man movement that we still bear the fruit of. I see hope that we have a Kemi, a Dr. Kemi here at Ford University, and I hope those of you who are students will take her classes. And those individuals who are teaching in a way that will introduce you to other forms of thought that will complicate your worldview. I see hope all around me. I see hope when I see the sun. When I don't see the sun, we have a problem.
And I hope you're going to see some sun in Oregon in the next few days. But I want to thank Dr. Claudia May and Dr. Kemi, my colleague here at the University of Oregon. And definitely there's a lot to think about. And you know, as some of us know, hope does not disappoint.
All right, can we give a big round of applause for our lovely speakers and our moderator? So this is not the end. Before we leave, we would like you to fill out the rest of the survey. So while you do that, I'm going to take some time thanking this evening's forum sponsors. This event was sponsored by ASUO, Arab Student Union, Alpha Phi Omega, CMAE, Kodak, Crew, Division of Equity and Inclusion, First Baptist Church, InterVarsity, and UO Graduate Christian Fellowship. All of these sponsors provide support to students on campus, and we hope that you'll check them out. On this survey, I would like to highlight something that's really important. I think for many of us, this discussion probably brought up different things, whether it's convictions or hope for the future, or just a desire to talk more about this. So if you identify with that, we would really like you to check that you want to continue discussing tonight's topic with other participants and write down your contact information so that we can follow up with you. And also after this, there's going to be food in the back, and we would really like you to stay and just continue this discussion and to continue reflecting on this topic. So please take the moment to do that. And there will be people at the door to collect your survey cards, and you can stick around for food and have conversations with your neighbor. Thanks for coming.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.